Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dharma podcast. In this episode, we will explore several important dimensions and aspects of what is known as Indian nationalism, secularism, and related topics. And so, without further ado, let's begin. Now, when we pause for a moment, just for a moment, when we pause and think, it becomes clear to us that most things in life are really simple. Things like our daily routine, the way we dress, the clothes we wear, the weather, our city, the society around us, people around us, and something as simple, something as basic as the innate love that we have for our country. Now, all these things are really simple because they are rooted in fundamental human impulses. And the best example that describes a innate fundamental human impulse is the love of a mother for her infant. And it is these simple things that have given order and that have sustained human life across space and time since the proverbial dawn of human civilization. And you will notice this clearly when you observe a child which instinctively, intuitively recognizes and responds to these fundamental human impulses. And it is really that simple. It is that simple unless you step into places like the Jawaharlal Nehru University and then you start believing in the toxic stuff that they regularly produce. I have deliberately used the phrase love for the country just a while ago because love for one's country is one of the purest and clearest definitions of the term nationalism. To understand this in a deeper fashion, in a detailed fashion, we can use the Indian freedom struggle as a backdrop. Now, the one common element, and in fact the quintessential thread that fused and animated the freedom struggle was nationalism. And this nationalism was not merely expressed in its outward physical manifestations like political rallies, demonstrations, violent and non-violent resistance. Yes, it was all this, but it was also much more, and it informed and it revealed itself. For example, in the paintings of, say, Abanindranath Tagore, in the poetry of Subramanya Bharati, in the works and poetry of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, in numerous songs written in various languages of India for school children, school textbooks, school poetry written for children on themes that extolled the glory of India. The list of such productions is nearly endless. And the fact that India produced perhaps the most prolific and the best output in almost all fields during the entire century of the freedom struggle, this phenomenon is not at all coincidental. While Islamic invasions and the subsequent long period of Muslim rule in India had battered the body, the soul of Bharatavarsha had more or less remained intact. In fact, Hindus never rested, Hindus never stopped resisting this alien oppressive rule. But the freedom struggle, apart from securing political freedom, was also a two-pronged struggle for a far more profound nature. This was a struggle to stop the corrosion of the cultural soul of India and also to simultaneously recover the best elements of our culture. This was not nationalism in theory. It wasn't a topic of vacuous and brainless TV debates. This was something that was lived out on the theatre of an ancient civilization's destiny. It is also a true story which has never been told in full till date. It is a story that moved a towering American scholar like Will Durant. Will Durant was so deeply moved by it that when he visited India for collecting material for doing research as part of his monumental volumes titled Story of Civilization. Durant decided to stay back in India. He decided to take a break from the work on the story of civilization, and as he stayed in India, he decided to learn more about this country, its civilization, its history, and its society. And what he discovered here shocked and depressed him. It led him to write another classic. The name of the book is The Case for India. And I will read out a couple of portions from that lovely book. Quote, I saw such things in India as made me feel that study and writing were frivolous things in the presence of 1/5 of the human race suffering poverty and oppression bitterer than any to be found elsewhere on the earth. The more I read, the more I read, the more I was filled with astonishment and indignation at the deliberate bleeding of India by England throughout 150 years. I began to feel that I had come upon the greatest crime in all history. The British conquest of India was a destruction of a high civilization by a trading company utterly without scruple or principle, careless of art and greedy of gain, overrunning with fire and sword, a country temporarily disordered and helpless. The present plunder has now gone beyond bearing. Year by year, it is destroying one of the greatest and gentlest peoples of history. Close quote. You know what is a greater tragedy? The greater tragedy is the fact that the case for India, Will Durant's book, has not been prescribed as a textbook, or even portions of the book have not been prescribed in our mainstream curriculum even 70 plus years after our nominal liberation from British colonial rule, and this alone should make us introspect deeper on the true meaning of freedom and independence. In fact, from another perspective, the period of our freedom struggle can also be called truly the era of the modern Indian Renaissance, and this was a phrase that the iconic history scholar Romesh Chandra Majumdar uses repeatedly in some of his books. And then there is a familiar and a stale argument that it was the British who for the first time united India politically, until which time India was a disjointed mass of kingdoms which were continuously warring with each other. If that is the case, how did the people of these same warring regions, of these hostile kingdoms, how did they all come together to fight the same colonial British? The answer to this question, once again, lies in the unique phenomenon called Indian nationalism. It is a nationalism of a wholly different kind, and one of its definitions, one of its beautiful definitions, is given by a titan of Indian history, Professor S. Shrikanta Shastri, and I'll quote, "The culture of India, like the country itself, is indivisible and timeless, just like its indivisible geography that stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Kashi Vishveshwara to Rameshwara, from Bindu Madhava to Setu Madhava. Indian culture too represents this indivisible continuum from the rishis of the Vedas all the way up to Ramakrishna Paramahamsa." This, I think, is one of the purest definitions of Indian nationalism. In other words, Indian nationalism is also the expression of the timeless cultural unity of Bharatavarsha, and this cultural university was recognized as the chief obstacle by the British, who introduced a soulless and deracinating education system which was precisely aimed at destroying this spiritual culture and the cultural unity of Bharatavarsha. And this is precisely where an exhaustive study of the modern Indian Renaissance becomes so invaluable. A large number of truly extraordinary Indians of that period, when they saw what the British were doing with their so called English education system, these extraordinary Indians during the modern Indian Renaissance period, they hit back against this British education with surgical precision. And you know how they did that? They did that by tapping into precisely this cultural and civilizational unity of Bharatavarsha. They used our ancient symbolism, they used our deities, they used our inspirational messages of the rishis and the sadhus, they re-emphasized and repurposed our ideals and values, and they shaped and they sculpted a deeper and a more elevated brand of freedom struggle. For example, even today, a foreign scholar of Indology, a foreigner, a scholar of Indian culture, her name is Diana Eck, and she has astutely realized this cultural unity of India when she titled her book, India, a Sacred Geography. You see, she could have used any other title, but she chose to use this very pithy, very straightforward, but a title that encompasses all of Indian traditions. When she says India, a sacred geography. And that is something that today's Hindus should learn how to do. Anyway, long story short, Indian nationalism cannot be separated from Hindu culture and civilization. But yet, tragically, it appears that once we gained independence, we not only abandoned nationalism, but we transformed the word into an obscenity, into a cuss word. As numerous scholars and thinkers over several decades have pointed out, and I'm only borrowing from them, the reason why nationalism has become a cuss word is that we expelled our colonizer from our physical geography, but we retained the mental and psychological chains of our colonizers. And this is a weakness of national spirit which we have sadly still been unable to shake off, although much improvement has been made on that front. And I'll read out one quote to illustrate this mental colonization. Quote, "Honorable members, I ask you members to stand in your places to pay tribute of respect to Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who by his grim determination and steadfast devotion was able to carve out and found Pakistan, and whose passing away at this moment is an irreparable loss to all." Close quote. Guess who said this? This was the Honorable First President of Independent India, Dr. Babu Rajendra Prasad. This was his address to the Constituent Assembly of India on Thursday, November 4th, 1948. If his statement in the Constituent Assembly of India, if this is not a weakness of spirit, I don't know what else is. It is the same weakness of spirit that characterized the Congress party beginning with Nawab Nehru and downwards. It is the same weakness of spirit that also made Nawab Nehru shed tears on the death of a genocidal communist maniac, Stalin. Nawab Nehru, as we all know, was an incurable addict of Soviet Russia. He was deeply enamored by Stalin, and he used to address Stalin not by his full name, but he used to address him as Marshal Stalin. And this man, Nawab Nehru, when Stalin died, he stood up in the Indian Parliament and gave a call for adjourning the Indian Parliament for 2 days. Small wonder that today the gasping vestiges of the Congress party, headed by, I don't know who, but I'm assuming headed by Rahul Gandhi, this party, whatever is left of this party, its behavior makes us wonder if this is the National Party of Pakistan which is fighting elections on Indian soil. But there's also another valuable perspective to this phenomenon. One of India's greatest cultural icons, Shri D.V. Gundappa or DVG, he participated in and he contributed to the freedom movement in a multidimensional fashion throughout his life. And he wrote the following in an article which was written more than 60 years back, and I quote, "But the key element in the demand for Swarajya was the eviction of foreigners from India. But back then, it wasn't clear in anybody's mind as to the sort of people who would take the place of these foreigners. Why has what had appeared as an attractive political system in that period become so abhorrent in practical experience today? To state the truth, it is we who deceived ourselves. Back then, we didn't have an estimate of how wretched human nature will become when it is given the treasure called political power. Our zeal for freedom concealed this basic and natural human weakness from us. Just as a person who has gone hungry for years together begins to gorge when he is assured of an unlimited food supply, so did our political leaders indulge in loot, exploitation and oppression when they took the place of the foreigner." This is what DVG wrote more than 60 years back. And so, if a free India was quick to abandon nationalism, if this free India demonized nationalism, we should not be surprised. It was as if nationalism had an expiry date. It had no use for a political class after the British departed. But what was truly bizarre is the fact that nationalism was replaced by something called secularism. We now know where secularism has led us to and where it continues to lead us to. Let's look at another analysis from a different perspective. In his analysis of the Indian Constitution sometime in the early 1960s, the brilliant and encyclopedic scholar Bharataratna Mahamahopadhyaya Pandurang Vaman Kane, author of the monumental treatise in 6 volumes, The History of Dharmashastras, he says, in the final volume of the History of Dharmashastras, this is what he says: "The Constitution engenders a feeling among common people that they have rights and no obligations whatsoever, and that the masses have the right to impose their will and give the force of law to their own ideas and norms formed in their own cottages and tea shops." Close quote. Think about this. Think deeply about what P.V. Kane has actually said here. Admire his foresight. And now, think about the kind of writing that is routinely published on toxic and anti-India platforms like The Wire, Scroll.in, Caravan, and all their cousins and brothers and sisters, that extended family of Breaking India Forces. It is crystal clear from that the opinion and the analysis and other trash published on all these platforms are precisely formed in their own cottages, tea shops, or to use today's idiom, these toxic analysis and opinions are formed, They are concocted in their coffee shops, in swanky and expensive pubs and nightclubs. And these are the people who are regarded as commentators and analysts today. Which brings us back again to the period of the modern Indian Renaissance. That era, it threw up luminaries like P.V. Kane by the dozen. And the post-independence period of India has created these degenerate publications like Wire, Scroll, Caravan, etc., which are all controlled by anti-India rogues and generously funded by Breaking India forces, both within India and from abroad. Now, let's once again look at what P.V. Kane says, and I quote, "The Constitution has no chapter on the duties of the people to the country or to the people of India as a whole. Another criticism is that there are too many amendments. The very first amendment was made within less than a year and a half from the day the Constitution came into force. One fails to understand the meaning of the words fundamental rights in the Constitution, which took over 2 years of deliberations, if they could be changed within a year and a half." Close quote. Needless, P.V. Kane was extraordinarily foresighted. He was clairvoyant, to say the least. And it is at such fundamental levels that our nation needs to engage in serious soul searching and honest introspection if we are really serious about things like being the next superpower and Vishwaguru and so on. These are all nice and well-meaning slogans, no doubt, but they will sound empty and meaningless and ultimately fruitless unless they are supported by a solid philosophical and spiritual foundation. The same foundation that gave birth to the luminaries of the Indian Renaissance. Let's look at P.V. Kane once again. In fact, we are planning to do a separate series on some of the invaluable contributions of P.V. Kane. So let's see what he says. "It is remarkable that the directive principles mostly contain provisions on the economic system for raising people's standard of living. The directive principles should also have put equal or greater emphasis on the moral and spiritual values and should have called upon the state to promote among the people high moral standards, self-discipline, cooperation, sense of responsibility, kindliness, and high endeavor. A secular state should not mean a godless state or a state that has nothing to do with moral and spiritual values." Close quote. So, what kind of an Indian state and people has secularism created in these last 70 years? What kind of a state has the abandonment of a spirit of nationalism has free India created in the last 7+ decades? It has created a class of intellectuals, academics, journalists, and so on, who resort to and encourage vulgar name-calling, slander, personal abuse, and sexual innuendos against people occupying high constitutional posts, against genuine stalwarts and sages. It has created a large group of people who continue to feed off taxpayer money to abuse India on foreign soil. A random example that comes to mind is the goddess of vulgar things, Arundhati Roy. Indeed, someone who talks about such things as self-discipline, self-restraint, national responsibility, compassion, they are dismissed as old-fashioned and regressive. 70 years of secularism has created an India within an India whose ruling slogan is this: decency is superstition, gratitude is unfashionable. But unfortunately, we as a nation today, we are so far gone down the drain that it takes a prime minister to get down on the streets with a broom in his hand to remind his own people that India, their own country, belongs to them. This is also one of the meanings of nationalism. And here we find a powerful echo in Will Durant when he says that to be dirty is to be unfree. It may be symbolic, but the sheer amount of filth and squalor that we witness across India today is an outward manifestation of the inner corruption of the national soul, which continues to be infected by the Congress virus called post-independence mental colonialism. And so when we have converted nationalism into a term of abuse, when we have morphed it into an obscenity, are we still surprised that from 1947 onwards, India has produced at least 3 or 4 generations of people who believe that there is no noble ideal, there is no worthwhile goal worth practicing. It is this calculated and state-sponsored abuse of nationalism which in turn produces toxic textbooks designed to make a child hate himself and his country and his culture. And so, why do we blame if our children take the first ticket to the United States or Europe or Australia never to return? You taught them, your textbooks taught them to hate themselves and their country. And so, we clearly see how all these seemingly insignificant, minor and isolated factors are so powerfully interconnected that even a slight rupture in the thread of nationalism will slowly make everything come apart. In fact, we don't need to actually search for it. We already have its logical outcome. In fact, we have the exact specimen that will emerge if we continuously denigrate nationalism and all the values associated with it. The name of this specimen is Kanhaiya Kumar. Bharat tere tukde honge, inshallah, inshallah. This secularism has created him. Which brings us to the final point of this episode. I have a simple question. Why is nationalism even a topic for a debate? It is a given. It is a self-evident truth. It is an intrinsic value by and in itself. How European or other countries used nationalism for destructive purposes, that is none of our concern as Indians, because our lived and glorious experience of nationalism and its values, it has been truly profound. The negative and destructive experience of European nationalism at best should serve us as a warning. As I narrated at the beginning of this episode, all these are all really, really simple. They are all very basic things that everyone knows intuitively. But then, it is a truism that the simplest things are the hardest to master. Even harder to perform, even harder to live. Like nationalism, which fundamentally is a sense of deep gratitude towards the country that sustains us, that nourishes us, that helps us achieve our dreams and goals with others who inhabit the same land, who share the same culture and values. And in the case of Bharatavarsha, nationalism is our cultural inheritance, which is encrusted beautifully in just 4 simple but profound words: Rita, Satya, Dharma, Rina. And on that elevating note, we can conclude this episode of the Dharma podcast. We sincerely hope you enjoyed and found this episode useful. And like always, please like and share our work and do subscribe to the Dharma Dispatch channel. Buy some super thanks stickers to support our work, or do considering contributing to our dedicated work. Thank you and namaste.